Welcome to the Latin American Perspectives podcast. My name is Alexander Scott. I am your host and the outreach coordinator here at Latin American Perspectives. For this episode, I will be talking with LAP coordinating editors Andrew Smolski and Matthew Lorenzen on their new January 2021 issue of Latin American Perspectives. The issue is titled Violence, Capital Accumulation, and Resistance in Contemporary Latin America. It was just released last week, and I must say it is an incredible resource for learning about the structural roots of violence in Latin America and on violence's connections with capitalism and colonialism. If you enjoy our conversation for this episode and want to learn more about any of these topics, I encourage you to check out the issue at latinamericanperspectives.com or on LAP's page on the Sage Journal website. Now, let's get to the show. Andrew and Matt, before we start, would you guys like to introduce yourselves for our listeners?
Hi, I'm Andrew Smolski. I'm a doctoral candidate at North Carolina State University in the Department of Sociology and Anthropology. My work largely centers on a Marxist structural analysis of agriculture and environmental sustainability in agriculture. However, and as this issue shows, I also have a more generalist interest in building a better world and the way that capital impedes that capacity and how capital does that through incredibly violent means, despite how its media frames itself as not doing that. So that's who I am, and I'm just very glad to be here with y'all.
Hi, I'm Matthew Lorenzen. I'm an associate researcher at the Institute of Geography of Mexico's National Autonomous University, the UNAM. And my research interests include migration, new ruralities, mixed migration from Mexico, the governments of common pool resources, and the forest transition. And my work currently focuses on the Mixteca Alta region in the Mexican state of Oaxaca. I previously worked at Mexico's National Population Council and at USC, University of Southern California.
Great. Thank you both for sharing that information. I'm really excited to have you both here. Before we get into the details of the issue, I was hoping you could both individually or both of you could provide some background information on this issue, on the theme of the issue, and how it came about, how both of you came to be co-editors on this.
It was probably at the end of 2016, maybe a little bit before, when we first discussed the possibility of organizing this special issue. Andrew and I had actually just met maybe a year before. We met because we had both been writing opinion pieces about Mexico in the same magazine around 2014, 2015. And Andrew had written various articles on the drug war, on the Sente Teachers protest movement in Mexico. I had written a few pieces on Ayotzinapa, on the disappearance of the 43 students. So that's how we came together. We were both interested on social movements in Mexico, on violence in Mexico, especially the structural causes of violence. And once we started corresponding, we first had the idea of writing an academic article about the structural causes of violence in Mexico and the emergence of recent social movements in response to that violence. So we have to remember that Calderon government had recently launched the drug war, and this had sparked a whole series of social movements seeking to build peace in Mexico. So that was really something that caught our attention. So we both agreed that what was needed in the literature was to focus more on structural causes of violence, not just the immediate causes like the drug war, but what was behind. Why was Mexico such a tinderbox, so to speak? And we both agreed that neoliberal capitalism was one of the most important structural causes of violence in Mexico. So in the end, we decided that an article was not enough. We really should work on a whole issue dealing with this topic. And we eventually decided that we should widen the issue to Latin America as a whole.
Andy, did you want to add anything to that?
Yeah, and at that time that we were developing these ideas, a book had come out by Don Marie Paley, Drug War Capitalism, that also is kind of crystallizing this line of thought. And actually, an interview that I did with Paley was in Counterpunch as well. That was focusing kind of on what Matt was saying very well about those structural causes that we often kind of try, or the way that capitalist corporate media tries to frame this, and definitely the way that governments try to frame this is, there's just criminal elements, right? And we had to push back on that and really reframe that debate. And Paley's book, Drug War Capitalism, at least in my instance, was definitely a major turning point in my thinking about how to situate that structural cause relative to it. And I think another major point too that Matt and I were having a conversation around, and something that comes out in this issue, is that, well, yes, these are policies often implemented by right-wing governments. Left-wing or progressive governments have also utilized these mechanisms. And if we kind of obscure that fact, we'll miss some of the components of that structural analysis that we need.
So this issue is framed as a structural challenge to this dominant or traditional capitalist framing of violence. So can you explain the difference between these two frames and why a structural approach is so valuable and significant?
Well, so let's separate it out, right? The mainstream type of analysis is definitely that violence is the result of criminal elements, delinquents, etc., or at least say the more punitive version of it. And the way that then you address that violence is through law and order type policies. And in our introduction, we point out there's like another strand within that kind of mainstream discourse that also says something along the lines of like, okay, yeah, they're criminal elements, but they're criminal elements because of social deprivation. But what occurs is they don't discuss why there's social deprivation, right? So you can have two mainstream discourses that play off one another. One, which is this law and order, let's go in with guns a-blazing with police and state security forces and crush the criminal elements. And then another kind of softer version of that in which, okay, let's build into our institutions stronger safeguards to reduce corruption and reduce social deprivation. And through that, then we'll be able to tamper down the violence. And what a structural analysis says, criticizing those two frames, it says, that social deprivation doesn't just come out of nowhere. It's not like the world exists in a way that just produces social deprivation. That's what the Marxist analysis would say is a way of naturalizing that situation. Instead, that social inequality is baked into the capitalist cake, so to say. By that we mean, like, if you're going to exploit labor, if you're going to extract natural resources from communities, if you're going to do these things to make capital, to make profit, then you're going to have to be able to move people off their lands. You're going to have to be able to control labor and their wages. And by dint of controlling their wages, i.e. reducing them to some minimal point of subsistence, you're going to create that social deprivation. So now, instead of just social deprivation coming out of nowhere, no, social deprivation is the outcome of a structure in which you have a concentration of wealth within the hands of political and economic elites, i.e. capitalists and the party machinery that supports them through legislation. And we need to analyze how they maintain that power. So that's how you end up with, maybe instead of like two frames, really three frames, where two of those frames reinforce one another, the law and order and kind of the softer, let's help people with poverty, and then this more critical frame that says that poverty is a result of the system that we've set up, And in order to address it, we need to transform that system into something more equitable and less hierarchical.
Yeah, just to put a name on things. So we have the previous punitive criminal justice perspectives, and we have the citizen security approach, which is rightly seen as a major improvement to those previous punitive criminal justice perspectives, because it supposedly addresses structural causes of violence. But we argue that they're not really looking at structural causes, they're looking at symptoms of something deeper. So citizen security approaches will say that violence is linked to, I don't know, poverty, inequality, youth unemployment, school dropout rates, the lack of state services, impunity, corruption, etc. But we have to ask ourselves if these are really structural causes or symptoms of something else. And I think it's pretty clear that you have to look at the wider economic and social system to explain why there's poverty, why there's youth unemployment, why there's lack of state services. And that wider economic and social system is neoliberal capitalism. And it seems that like you're not allowed to say that in the literature on citizen security.
And that the last point that he said is huge, that it seems and is likely true. Like if we did a content analysis of existing literature, that by and large, you aren't allowed to say that. And, you know, it's probably not like a hard and fast rule, but it's the way that the ideological filters operate that kind of drains that terminology Matt was just using so well out of the scholarly work that's getting produced.
Right. That isn't so surprising to me. I study like law enforcement in the United States and like theories of crime and criminality in the US. And there's like in the United States, there's very little conversation about structural, reasons for violence and inequality. It's all this, primarily this punitive sort of broken windows policing theories of like, inherent criminality and deviance. And if you look at who's promoted those ideas, it's a lot of these, right-wing and neoliberal think tanks that just dominate the academy, that dominate the literature in a lot of these areas of like, criminology. So that's not so surprising, but it is concerning, right? That it's like they vetted the literature in that way. That's now you both have we've already started talking about Marx, so we might as well go there. So as you're taking this structural approach, you can see the relevance of a Marxist theory of political economy, capital accumulation, and how that informs your understandings of violence. So I was hoping we could unpack that a little for the listeners. Like, what is Marx's theory of capital accumulation? Andrew, you were touching upon like primitive accumulation, and we don't have to go into real detail because these are huge topics. Like we could do a whole podcast just on this, but if we could just unpack this a little, like how is the Marxist theory informing your structural understanding of violence?
I'll kick off with a short piece and then I want to pass it off to Matt.
Yeah, please. Yeah.
He's going to give some really good historical framing of this process, but like the basic way that I would typically, say teach a Marxian analysis is starting and rooting it in an understanding of exploitation. And there's a way, kind of sardonically, that I and many others refer to as kind of what Marx would say is a magic trick, right? So, say in Capital Volume 1, what Marx does is he lays out this hypothetical example and he says, and I'll update it because I don't know shillings and pences and stuff like that, dollars and cents, right? So say you have $20 of material and you have $20 of labor and you'll make $40 worth of product that sells in the market for $40. And what Marx says that in order to get to a point of capital accumulation, let's get $40 of material, still pay the workers $20, make them work more hours, produce $80 of something to sell, and thereby make $20 on that production process. That $20, Marx says, is surplus value. That's what he says is the magic trick, because that's exploitation. It's paying labor less than the amount of value that they produce. And if you're going to have a system in which you're going to pay labor less than the surplus they're producing, that's going to require some kind of apparatus to keep labor in control, because labor doesn't just exist in a position of exploitation. You have to produce that. And that's at the point that I want to hand it off to Matt, who in our introduction really provided a lot of that historical background of how you transform the class system into one in which you can extract that surplus value from labor.
Yeah, so to understand the link between violence and capital accumulation, you really have to go back to primitive accumulation, what you were talking about. So this is a concept that Marx writes about in the first volume of Capital. Primitive accumulation is just basically the original accumulation of capital that set capitalism in motion. So it's something that started out in Europe as early as the 15th century. It was the expropriation, the violent expropriation and eviction of peasants whose lands were given away or sold at low prices to large private landowners, what is known as the enclosure movement. And this enabled the rise of capitalist agriculture, the development of an urban proletariat, and eventually the development of industrial capital and industrialization, urbanization, etc. So there's a famous quote in Capital that says that the end of feudal society and the rise of capitalism is written in the annals of mankind in letters of blood and fire. And this means that capitalism wasn't born of acts of inventiousness or people coming together and working to develop technologies, etc. Capital accumulation was born out of violence, out of the expropriation of peasants. And this continued outside of capitalism's core countries through colonialism, through the expropriation of colonized peoples of their goods, of their precious metals, etc. And Marx also explained how this primitive accumulation is tied to the expansion of crime. So the manufacturing sector, the nascent manufacturing sector was unable to absorb all the former peasants that were driven off the land. And as a result, these peasants were turned into robbers, vagabonds, beggars. That's what Marx says, right? And as a response, violent laws against begging and vagabonds were enacted throughout Europe, which entailed like really cruel punishments, like cutting people's hands off, or even deaths for repeat offenders, right? So in Marx, we already see an attempt to explain violence and also criminality through this root cause of primitive accumulation. And this continues through colonialism, neo-colonialism, and internal colonialism, which we can explain later on if you want.
And just real quick, Marx, he's arguing against these bourgeois economists when he's making this argument. And in our introduction, we write that see it in like this Panglossian sense, right? That in these Panglossian goggles of, it's really, we all come together as buyers and sellers in a market, and they naturalize the existence of the market. But the moment you switch the script and you frame it in this Marxian sense that Matt just laid out, you can no longer just think that a market is this simple set of buyers and sellers that has always existed. Instead, it's something that has to be instituted. And in this case, it's instituted at the point of a gun. And that continues to draw that distinction, right, that I think is crucial between these different ways of framing criminality.
Yeah, absolutely. Everything both of you just said is really incredibly important, especially right now with all these conversations around, at least domestically here in the United States, around issues of defunding the police and what is the nature of law enforcement. And you can, if you approach the issue from this structural Marxist analysis, you can begin to understand really the origins of law enforcement and the modern conception of crime and a lot of modern laws we're still living with, right? And how inequality and poverty are produced and feed into these ideas of deviance, and crime. Now, Matt, you mentioned how this process of capital accumulation and primitive accumulation really played a central role in European colonial and imperial ventures in the periphery, throughout Latin America and other continents like Africa and Asia. I was hoping we could talk about this more. Like, how did these processes of colonialism and imperialism, how are those related to capital accumulation, and how did these processes inform violence in Latin America?
So there's three concepts we need to keep in mind, which is colonialism, neocolonialism, and internal colonialism. So as I mentioned, for Marx, colonialism was an important part of primitive accumulation. So through colonialism, capitalism's core countries secured markets for their manufacturers, usually through monopolies. They also captured goods, precious metals, raw materials, and these were sent back to their mother countries and then converted into capital. And that capital fueled industrial capitalist development, which allowed Western Europe to develop, while Asia, Africa, Latin America were kept in a state of underdevelopment, right? And slave trade and slave labor also represented a crucial part of this early colonialism. So despite the end of colonialism in the 18th, 19th, and 20th centuries, in reality, colonial practices continued through what is known as neocolonialism. Neocolonialism is how these relations of dominance continued using rich countries' financial power, but also their direct violence and the threat of violence. So if you think of military coups supported by the US, that's a form of neocolonialism, because the goal was to preserve pro-capitalist governments, and even ushering in neoliberalism was in a lot of cases through violence, right? Think of Chile. So this neocolonialism allowed for continued exploitation of labor and natural resources, and a control over the economic policy of developing nation, which allowed for continuing this transfer of wealth from poor countries to rich countries, right? That's neocolonialism in a nutshell. Internal colonialism is a concept best described by Pablo González Casanova. It refers to the exploitation and dominance of formerly colonized people by local elites after national independences, right? These local elites that replaced European colonial elites. So internal colonialism is tied into neocolonialism because these local elites help advance transnational capitalist interests in their own countries. And this is also connected to sort of how racism is connected to colonialism. So you have these local elites, usually white descendants of white Europeans, while the exploited native groups are usually Black and brown people, right? And finally, this idea of internal colonialism is connected to another concept that we explore in the issue and the introduction, which is necropolitics. This is developed by an author called Achille Bembe. Well, it refers first how social and political power is used to dictate who lives and who dies, right? And who lives and who dies is connected inevitably to race and class, right? So that's sort of how we see the link between violence, colonialism, and how colonialism perpetuates itself even after it formally ended in the 19th, 20th centuries, right?
building on that last concept of necropolitics and this racial hierarchy that's utilized, Mbembe is producing a corollary concept to what Foucault called biopolitics, because if you develop, say, these welfare states, which do come after a certain period of violence within European countries, the United States, etc., against white workers, there's this moment where the state begins to kind of offer up some level of benefits to get kind of buy-in, what Gramsci would call hegemony, which doesn't just require coercion, it requires also what he says is spontaneous consent, that people begin to accept the order of things. And this is one way that it happens, because this biopolitics where we'll provide some semblance of healthcare, we'll provide some semblance of education, but only to those classified as white, and they're brought in and they'll buy in through that. And necropolitics is where the state produces a state of exception for all racial groups that aren't labeled white, that they exist outside of that biopolitical apparatus, and then therefore, like Matt was saying, they can be killed. Their existence is not going to provide them with equality before the law, with the human rights that many white workers assume as their privilege. And it's by dint of that this apparatus is able to continue to operate in terms of the link between violence and capital accumulation, because you have produced through the state, through the way that the state legislates who has rights and access to general welfare, you produce this population that's dehumanized and outside, and therefore can continue to be displaced. And this was a criticism that Rosa Luxemburg had of kind of Marx's understanding of the decline of violence by capital, because it didn't include the way that violence continued to operate against the colonized other. And that's why we really need to be able to link the state to capital, and then the role of the state in producing, maintaining this racialized hierarchy within these societies and that state of exception.
I appreciate both of you discussing that a bit, because I think it's understandable how sometimes folks, they tend to frame these issues, colonialism, imperialism, like those are the ultimate forms of authoritarianism, of complete domination, and especially folks coming at it from a more liberal perspective. They often frame, the liberal, rights-based, egalitarian society as less authoritarian, less violent, less dominating. And, the theory of necropolitics, it also makes me think of like Polanzas and his structural theory of violence in the state and authoritarianism, and I just appreciate the nuance that these ideas are bringing to the table. It's like, no, even though colonialism has formally ended, there can still be these horrific regimes of domination and authoritarianism. And like you said, a state of exception that is affecting non-whites and people of color. I just really like that idea. I'll have to look. I haven't read about necropolitics, but I'll have to look that up because that sounds fascinating. Now, Matt started to touch on this, on the neoliberalism. We should probably unpack that a little bit for our listeners. Like, we don't have to go into serious detail, but like, what is neoliberalism, and how has it affected violence in Latin America? How have the political economic changes under neoliberalism, changed the landscape of violence?
Could I kick off? Because I wanted to provide, there's an important contrast that has to be made and why we would discuss something that's neoliberalism.
Yes, absolutely.
And so understanding that the era preceding it, what Philip McMichael would call the era of the development state, what others would call the welfare state, some would say Keynesianism, there are different ways of conceiving this, but it was a period in which worker power was at a peak in many countries, where struggle had been ongoing. There's leftist insurgencies throughout Latin America that are fighting back. and by dint of that had produced a certain terrain of struggle that we would say had benefits for the population overall to an extent, right? And so take Mexico, this is a period in which the state has quite strong control over the economy. Many industries are state-owned industries, and neoliberalism then is the contrast to that strong state and general idea of welfarism. And this is the moment where that contrast will help us to understand that there's a process then of state breaking, but it's not state breaking in like the left anarchist sense of developing the Federation of Communes, right? It's a state breaking with a specific emphasis on certain parts of the state that by breaking them, that control down would increase the power of the capitalist class, the transnational capitalist class, and also specific factions of that transnational capitalist class. And it's at that moment that I want to pass it off to Matt that I think can fill in some of the more important details about how that transition in the state and breakdown in the state leads to new contours of violence within the overall capitalist system. Because one last point on this, that like it's not a functionalist relationship. It's not like if capital therefore violence, right? It's if capital under X, Y, and Z conditions, then a certain set of outcomes in terms of who the violent actors are, who the violence is directed at, etc. And so this transition into neoliberalism, changing those actors to a certain extent and changing who the victims are going to be of that apparatus.
So I like the way Bourdieu explains neoliberalism. He says the state has two hands, a left hand and a right hand. The left hand is the hand that provides social welfare, education, health, etc. The right hand is the hand with the stick, right? It's police, military, surveillance. So neoliberalism, what happened was the left hand got really small and the right hand got really big, right? So that's neoliberalism. That's the state retreated from its social obligations, but it expanded in its police state function, right? So to explain the link between neoliberalism and violence, we have to think about the concept of structural violence, which is developed especially by Johann Galtung. So structural violence, it basically means social injustice, right? So like lack of education opportunities, income inequality, lack of access to medical services. It's when violence doesn't have an immediate actor, right? It's when people getting harmed is caused by something deep in the social structure. And neoliberal capitalism tends to exacerbate this structural violence because the role of the state in providing welfare is reduced. So this is also linked into direct violence. So Galtung says that structural violence and direct violence are intimately connected, right? First, because backing up a system that is really socially unequal, socially unjust, requires the state to maintain the status quo, to protect the interests of those who benefit from this unequal social structure. Another way structural violence and direct violence are linked is because there's a correlation between elements of structural violence such as income inequality and violence. So there's a lot of studies that say that people, regions and countries that are really highly unequal in income and education opportunities, those are places where you'll usually find a lot of violence. And obviously neoliberalism exacerbates structural violence, and thus it exacerbates direct violence through this correlation. And another way neoliberalism and violence are connected is through what David Harvey calls accumulation by dispossession. And this is a key part of contemporary capital accumulation. So accumulation by dispossession is basically just primitive accumulation today. It's how primitive accumulation works today. So it consists, among other things, like enclosing the commons, right? Privatizing common goods, privatizing cultural commons, privatizing natural commons. Also, its intensive exploitation and its commodification, right? So concrete examples of accumulation by dispossession include like land grabbing by agribusiness, mining, gas and oil concessions, and public-private mega projects like airports, highways, wind farms. And these often affect indigenous communities, right? Indigenous or rural communities who are dispossessed of their access to land, of their access to water, of their access to air even. And this is primitive accumulation or accumulation by dispossession happening during the neoliberal era. And finally, there's this idea of drug war capitalism, how violence produced by the drug war actually helps advance neoliberal policies through the social control it produces, right? So violence produced by the drug war weakens capacity to resist neoliberal policies, to resist mega projects, to resist extractive activities, and so on. So, and finally, there's the issue of globalization. So globalization creates opportunities for transnational crime to grow, to really turn into these multinational corporations like the Sinaloa cartel that operates in over half the world's countries, right? So those are some of the ways how neoliberalism is tied to violence.
And going back to that point on drug war capitalism, right, and the changing contours, if making that contrast again with the prior era, Don Paley in this issue makes note of like a Cold War logic, right? I mentioned, there's left-wing insurgency throughout the region. There's a lot of workers' power, peasant power that had been building and had really organized itself and was able to, win concessions from capital, from the state. And during that period, what Paley is noting is that it's a period of a Cold War logic of enforced disappearance, where this violence is directed at individuals that are themselves politically organizing. So it is a form of class war, whereby the state and capital are removing those elements that are best able to build these coalitions. And so once that bulwark of power is taken out, the contours of who the victims are into the neoliberal era change to where the victims are now kind of depoliticized sectors. As Matt was saying, the left hand is reduced to its minimum point, in terms of those social services, and also in terms of capacity to find formal employment is also heavily reduced. The informal economy throughout Latin America explodes during the neoliberal era. And by dint of that, you wind up with what Marx would call kind of the surplus population. And so enforced disappearance transforms to be, focused on these younger male surplus population relative to employment. And that's because of this reduction in the state and also the reduction in the capacity to organize. And as Matt, pointed out, that means that the way that neoliberal violence works is to kind of maintain that low ebb in social struggle as a form of social control, keeping populations down that had kind of been beaten back by the Cold War logic throughout the region. And that's something I think by dint of how the neoliberal era has worked ideologically, right? What did Margaret Thatcher say? Tina, there is no alternative. It is kind of obfuscating that class struggle role, that it kind of invisibilizes the way that the drug war operates as a form of continuing class struggle. And then therefore things like citizen security frameworks also continue that invisibilization, right? And so this is a way, if we can start understanding neoliberal capital as a continuation, right, of that class struggle, we can better then understand what it would mean to resurface organizing under those dynamics. I hope I was clear on that, Matt. Let me know if that didn't come out properly.
I thought that was very clear. I will say, though, this is just, as people who study this, this might not be that surprising to us, but like This is such a different perspective on issues like the drug war in Mexico than most folks are going to be used to hearing. But it's really important and really valuable because it sheds a whole new light on the issue. I think often when folks think about the drug war in Mexico, at least, people, gringos here in the US, or maybe liberals and conservatives in Latin America, they see it as like, oh, well, that has to be so bad for their economy. Like, oh, like nobody wants the drug violence like that. But as both of you were alluding to, is that actually the violence, the narco economy is intimately connected to this neoliberalization of Latin America. And it served a direct function in impeding organizing, in impeding and inhibiting sort of working class solidarity and social movements, right? Unfortunately, most folks get their understanding of this issue from, narco novellas and shows like Narcos, which don't do a really good job of addressing this perspective at all. Now, with that being said, what does resistance in the neoliberal era look like? What is working class resistance and in challenging violence? And how has resistance produced different forms of peace?
So I think there's always resistance. I mean, there are cases where the situation is so repressive that you might not get real resistance, but for the most part, there's always some sort of resistance, right, to this accumulation-driven violence. So here we have to borrow again from Johann Galtung. He talked about a vicious violence triangle that was made up of direct violence, structural violence, and cultural violence. So we already talked about structural violence and direct violence. And cultural violence means any aspect of a culture that is used to justify direct or structural violence. So religion, ideology, even art forms can be part of cultural violence. And Galtung gives this example of the African slave trade. So this was a massive form of direct violence that over decades seeped down into the social structure and became structural violence against Black people all over the Americas. And it also became a form of cultural violence against Black people through white supremacist culture. Right? And for Galtung, the way to confront this violence triangle was through a virtuous triangle of peace, he calls it. So it includes direct peace, structural peace, and cultural peace, which are the opposite, right? Direct peace is like acts of cooperation, agreement, support, reconciliation, and so on. Structural peace are acts that seek to build community, so that seek to diminish social inequality, that seek to build economic opportunities, educational opportunities. And cultural peace is any aspect of a culture that brings about direct peace and structural peace. So for Galtung, the best way to reach this peace would be to combine these three corners of the peace triangle. So you need direct peace, you need cultural peace, and you need structural peace. And you need to implement them at the same time. And this is why he makes the distinction between negative peace and positive peace. So negative peace is just when you don't have direct violence, right? But positive peace is when you not only don't have direct violence, but you also don't have structural violence and you don't have cultural violence. In negative peace, when you just manage to get rid of direct violence, the problem is that direct violence can come back. It can always come back. But when you manage to address structural violence, it's more difficult for violence to come back because you don't have you get rid of the structural roots of violence, right? So what we found in the articles that were presented in this issue is that the best ways to reach a lasting peace are the strategies that reach a positive peace, right? That address structural violence. So, for example, one of the articles is about a community in Michoacán that's called Cherán. So Cherán is this community that rebelled in 2011 against this criminal organization that was kidnapping people, extorting people, and doing illegal logging. So the residents, they not only rebelled and got rid of the municipal government and installed a new form of self-government based on indigenous uses and customs, but they also decided that for peace to last, they needed to rebuild their community. They needed to they needed to do community building, which means providing economic opportunities for people, providing participatory democracy opportunities to people, steps towards reconciliation with people that were involved in the criminal organization. So this is cultural peace that we were talking about. So they needed to build the foundations for a peaceful society, right? They just getting rid of the criminal organization wasn't enough because they would eventually come back. So they needed to build community, and that's the key to lasting peace, according to Galton and according to some of the articles in this issue.
In the issue, there's also examples of the negative piece. Like there's an article, and I think taking the concept of necropolitics and shifting it from, that state of exception to how what Olsen in his article writes is a subversive necropower, whereby the victims, such as the parents of the disappeared 43 students and the family of minors, are able to shame the government by naming their dead. And so while this does not shift the structural violence or do away with the structural violence, it becomes a way to begin a process of building that power through utilizing the dead, the disappeared, as an element that can build solidarity within communities. And that's crucial here. Like negative peace, I think, because negatives in it may seem like it's insufficient, and in a way, yes, right? It's not producing that positive peace. What Matt properly said, that structural change that's much harder to undo, but it is the elements and the blocks that make possible the movements towards that positive peace. And another, I think, key thing that Matt was pointing out is there are these situations in which the repression is just so strong that acquiescence may be the only possibility in a certain moment. So there's an article we have in the issue on Guatemala and a certain area in Guatemala where the repression has led to kind of a subjectivity of acquiescence, right? And it's understandable. It's not like people are just like throwing in the towel or something. It's, if you're constantly in a state of terror, it makes the crucial work necessary for building that power extremely hard. Maybe not impossible, but highly improbable. And those are key things to be thinking about when working towards and theorizing and studying social movement activity, right? What sociologists of social movements have said, what are the political opportunity structures, what are the political economic opportunity structures, and thereby strategizing based upon that. And I think in Latin America, in getting to something that actually Matt, when we were writing the introduction, sent me a very good criticism of something that I had written on how I was kind of framing the process of colonialism in a kind of functionalist manner. And he was pointing out the Spanish colonialism didn't like just come in and like do away with indigenous structures, indigenous ways of being. And by dint of their continued existence, and we see this in certain articles in this thematic issue, providing an alternative base from which to struggle. And so, understanding the historical process and social conditions that people can struggle from, I think is a crucial task, so to say, for all of us concerned with building what Subcomandante Galeano would say are multiple better worlds, right? Because it's not just one world, that we can strategize from those points and those different terrains of struggle.
Another concept that's really interesting that several of the articles addresses is this gray zone. So The gray zone, it's this sort of blurring of the lines between private and public actors and illegal and legal actors. And this is another characteristic of neoliberalism and violence in Latin America. For example, one of the articles proposes this concept of mafia capitalism in Paraguay. So mafia capitalism is when the perpetrators of violence, you can't really distinguish between legal businessmen, illegal drug lords, state forces, and politicians, because they're the same people. They're or at least they're people that move around in the same groups. So this is really an important concept also that's addressed in some of the articles.
Andy, you want to add something?
Well, yeah, there's another important concept that's, I think, plays with that idea as well of hybrid governance, and that was the point about moral economy too, where like deviance is also not automatically a social problem. Like even violent deviance is not automatically a social problem for communities. It's when that deviance and violence disrupts what they said was like a moral framework. So on one end, you can have this integration that Matt's talking about of legal and illegal and that hybrid or gray zone. And then also this point that we should always consider that like deviance isn't automatically a social problem for communities. And there is probably an important point there that like deviance is actually normal for all communities. Like all communities have deviance. There's just certain moments, I think, where it catalyzes into something more, and then it has to be addressed in some way. Matt, should we read the Arundhati Roy quote? You know, that's the way you go out on these kinds of things. I really like that we ended the introduction that way, because like resistance is crucial, and she says it so well when she says, you know, another world is possible. And not only that, it's on the way. On a quiet day, I can hear her breathing, and that like it gives me chills each time I think about it, because there's a little bit of optimism there, a lot of optimism probably.
Yeah, and we need that, especially now. This was awesome. I hope you all enjoyed it. I'm really excited about your issue. Really, really interesting. Hopefully we can do this again in the future.
I'm really excited. Thank you, Alex, for your time today. Thank you, Matt, as always, for being an amazing co-editor, and we'll be in touch.
Yeah, absolutely. Stay safe, you guys, and thanks for doing this.
Thanks, Alex.
Well, folks, unfortunately, that is all the time we have for today, but I want to thank you for listening into our show. Please don't forget to add us on Facebook, Twitter, YouTube, Instagram, and all of our other social media sites. And please, share this podcast with your like-minded colleagues, comrades, compañeros y compañeras. We'll be back very soon with our next podcast. Hasta luego.